Relations at London Metropolitan University and Coventry University, and also I'm a member of ELIAMEP's Turkey program. ELIAMEP, Hellenic Foundation for Europeans Foreign Policy, Turkey program was established in 2020 under the leadership of Yannis Grigoriadis. The program mainly aims to promote consistent, reliable, and research-substantiated information and analysis of Turkey's domestic, political, and foreign policy developments in its relation with Europe, United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and other emerging powers. And also, most importantly, the program also aims to scrutinize Turkey's main issues, main discussions. Within this angle, today we would like to talk new Turkey's new diasporas with very important experts. As you know, roughly after 2011-12, Turkey's democratic backsliding has created a new wave of migration from Turkey, mostly towards Europe, but not limited only with Europe. Being a result of an undemocratic practices, economic uncertainties, and society's polarization, this new wave has been the most significant one since the 1990s, when the Kurdish asylum seekers fled Europe as a result of the armed conflict between Turkey and the PKK. This new wave is currently changing the profile of Turkey's diaspora in different countries, such as United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, and United States, and bringing new dynamics to the transnational space. New fellows bring new consultations with them, and Turkey's domestic politics, one way or another, has split over into different countries, multifaceted actions and actors, including the involvement of home and host states. While the main actors of the European Union and other multinational organizations have already expressed concerns about rising authoritarianism in Turkey, this new migration it is bringing the authoritarianism and transnational repression remain unexplored in these days. Today, within this aim, we would like to explore, we would like to scrutinize and unpack the question of new Turkey's new diasporas with very valuable experts. We have three speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Ayhan Kaya from Istanbul Bilgi University. Our second speaker is Bahar Baser from Coventry University, and also from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Our third speaker is Schenkkan from Freedom House. He's the director of the research strategy in Washington, D.C. And if you don't mind, without losing any more time, I would like to give the virtual floor to Professor Ayhan Kaya, and he will begin with his kickoff speech to explore Turkey's diaspora policies and the new Turkey's new understanding of the diasporas and throughout the changes during the Justice and Development Party, and then we will move with Bahar and Nate and accordingly. The floor is yours, Professor Kaya.
Erdi, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. And I'm also happy to take part in this organization organized by ELIAMEP, where I have several very close colleagues and friends. So let me just share my slides with you and use the time as much as possible efficiently. And what I will do here is just to give you a very brief historical analysis of the Turkish diaspora politics since the 1960s, and give the focus concentration on the Justice and Development Party's changing maneuvers in organizing diaspora politics currently, at least for the last few years. So when I take a look at the modern Turkey's diaspora politics, I see that there is a set of three, at least, different epochs, different periods in which Turkish state has framed its immigrants in Europe in different ways. Just to be very precise, I see that between the 1960s and 1980, we see the Turkish state framing the Turkish immigrants simply as economic agents, providing Turkey with remittances, and basically they were treated as economic agents. And in the second period, we see Turkey between 1980s, after the military coup of 1980, and 2002, when the Justice and Development Party came to power. We see that Turkey has framed its immigrants as political agents, in a way controlling each other to make sure that none of the centrifugal communities in diaspora will harm the Turkish state ideology, so to speak. So, because we know that between especially after 1980 coup, a lot of left-wing people, a lot of non-Turkish and non-Sunni people had to leave Turkey, such as the Alevis, Kurds, Assyrians, and left-wing people. So they, in a way, needed to be controlled by the state forces to make sure that they would not continue to be harming the Turkish state abroad and its interests. And the third period starts with the Justice and Development Party coming to power in 2002. Since then, especially, Turkish state has framed the Turkish immigrants simply as lobbying agents. And this has been very harmful, I will argue, creating a lot of polarization, a lot of dichotomies between different communities of Turkish origin in diaspora. And in this period, gradually we have seen that the Turkish state has used Islamist ideology and neo-Ottomanism as a way of infiltrating into the Turkish diaspora communities at the expense of alienating some of the groups, such as the Kemalists, secularists, Alevis, Kurds, non-Muslim communities. So in this period, we see a rather more fragmented, even more than it was earlier, a rather more fragmented set of Turkish origin people living in diaspora. So let's take a look at the Justice and Development Party era, in which the party has created some new liaison institutions, some originating from Turkey, one originating from the diaspora itself. And here I have come up at least 4 different important institutions which have played a very instrumental role in a way controlling the Turkish diaspora along the interests of the Islamist and neo-Ottomanist Justice and Development Party rule. Among them, the first one is, I believe, the Union of European Turkish Democrats, which has recently changed its name, and it is now Union of International Democrats. It has changed its name in 2018, and this is simply a liaison institution of the Justice and Development Party, established by the party itself. However, this has created a large, a big polarization or fragmentation, rather, in the Turkish diaspora, because this is a very much, Islamist and neo-Ottomanist kind of organization. And the other one, established during the Justice and Development Party rule, it's a public organization called Yunus Emre Cultural Centers, established in 2007. We have made extensive studies about the discourses promoted by this organization. And we see that this is one of those organizations which has disseminated a rather more neo-Ottomanist form of discourse across the Turkish diaspora, starting with the organization of such cultural centers, which are different, which are in a way similar to, let's say, German Goethe Institute or British Council. There is nothing wrong with organizing such, of course, centers, but the rhetoric, underlining rhetoric is that it is still a rather more neo-Ottomanist kind of organization promoting this kind of rhetoric. And the third one, which has become, I think, even more pivotal recently, along with the rise of the Islamist discourse of the Justice and Development Party and the President's office over the last few years, Diyanet, because Diyanet is promoting Sunni Islam. Diyanet is promoting AKP's official definition of Islam as opposed to the other official definitions of receiving states Islam and the official definition of Islam by other migrant sending countries. And I see that in the diaspora or in Europe at the moment, there is a competition among different versions of Islam promoted by receiving states such as German Islam, French Islam, Dutch Islam, Belgian Islam on the one hand, and the other forms of Islam promoted by the migrant sending countries, Turkish official version of Islam, Moroccan official version of Islam. And recently we conducted a study showing different versions of Islam promoted by different actors. And finally, the fourth actor here is the Directorate of Turks Overseas, established in 2010, which has become a very important, again, institution. So here, I want to, show some of the quotations to underline the neo-Ottomanist and Islamist discourse promoted by the Justice and Development Party as well as the President's office. We see that the emphasis is on the language and culture primarily. This is very much promoted by the Turkish president himself, as well as the other institutions. And the other emphasis is on religion, which was not the case earlier. So here we see a lot of different quotations by Recep Tayyip Erdogan or many other state actors, underlining that Turks living abroad or members of the Turkish diaspora should not forget their religion, should not assimilate, and they should always embrace their authenticity, their religion, their faith, their culture, etc. So here in this period, we see a very clear, message given to the members of the Turkish diaspora that religion, Islam, is a very important element that is taken into consideration by the Turkish state actors. And one last thing that I want to underline, Erdi, is that especially after the Justice and Development Party has become more authoritarian and President's office has become more authoritarian in a way, we see that there is also a growing interest in the Justice and Development Party's way of dealing with the Turkish diaspora is to use some vigilant organizations, which has also become recently a polemical debate in the Turkish context. And this, the employment of some vigilant organizations to control the Turkish diaspora communities has become more prevalent, especially after the Gezi movement, which has been very decisive for the revanchist Justice and Development Party rule, and also after the failed coup attempt, which has given the chance to the party ruling party to control the domestic and the international clientele of the Turkish government. And here, let me just open up a parenthesis just to give you an example of the vigilant organizations, which is Osmanlı Germania, established in Germany a few years ago. And this is one of the polemical debates, actually. Now it has been argued by different sources that there was an organic link between the Justice and Development Party and this vigilant organization, which was recently in 2018 banned by German authorities simply because of its violent nature. So vigilants have become very decisive in this process, defending the interests of the Justice and Development Party, or Turkey in particular. So to give you a very short conclusion, I see that in the last decade, especially after 2013 Gezi movements, there is a very prevalent societal and political polarization in the diaspora, of course, domestically in Turkey as well. And these Turkish diaspora communities have been exposed to several different kinds of polemics, especially during the electoral cycles in Turkey, because Justice and Development Party is the first party which has actually treated the members of the Turkish diaspora as electoral sources, as a great electoral source. And the third point that I need to make is that the way the Turkish diaspora is being organized by the Justice and Development Party has unfortunately harmed the interests of the members of the Turkish diaspora. And here I just can give you an example of Austrian government denouncing the double citizenship of some of the Turkish origin people. And this kind of politics, diaspora politics, based on authoritarianism, Islamism, and neo-Ottomanism has also heated up the transnational space between Turkey and the diaspora. And finally, unfortunately, the way things go has contributed to the promotion of this very wrong perception that there is a continuing war crescent and the cross. So this kind of religious perspective has also been very much promoted by the Justice and Development Party, based on the idea that there is this continuous fight between the crescent and the cross, which is, of course, totally wrong, because I still argue that the fight is a social economic fight, if there is a fight, but not a religious fight. So this is the way I see the current developments, Erdi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaya. It has been always pleasure for us to listen to you, because you are a very important figure for all of us. Today we talk about diasporas or migration, that thanks to you, your works, your very prolific profile, your articles teach us a lot. And now you are talking about clash of civilization and its impact, whether it's true or not. In my mind, your articles are common colleague and friends, Jeffrey Haynes, Jonathan Fox, and Justice Hazari's arguments regarding whether there is still a way to move to this very blurby and not good way to clash of civilization, and Turkey might be one of the players. But your concluding remarks regarding this is not a clash of civilization, this is mostly a civilization based on economy, social differences, or maybe social studies at the same time, is quite important and remarkable. But you mentioned a lot about authoritarianism, polarization, and the transformation of the how Justice and Development Party's Turkey has been using and instrumentalizing its diasporas. But I know very well from Bahar's work, I mean, she has been scrutinizing the discussions, disputes, and transformation outside the border of Turkey. And now I would like to hear some of her new research, some of her new findings and experiences regarding the exploitation of domestic conflicts, polarization, and the new Turkey's new diasporas in abroad. Bahar, the floor is yours right now.
Thank you so much, Erdi. I'll start by apologizing for my voice. I'm a little bit ill and I lost my voice 2 days ago, so hopefully I will last for 10 minutes. And secondly, I will also second what Erdi has said about Professor Kaya. It's a pleasure for me to present my work after him. He inspired me to start working on these issues, so it's a pleasure to share the same platform with him. So I will mostly focus on the new wave of migration from Turkey, which started with the Gezi protests. So as diaspora scholars who work on Turkey, we usually focus on a couple of waves. You know, the first one is the flow of guest workers in the 60s as a result of the bilateral economic agreements between several European states and Turkey. And then we talk about 70s and 80s, and due to the political turmoil and the coup in Turkey, there was a second wave, mostly Kurds and leftists and also Turkish nationalists. In the 90s, we talk about the Kurdish migration, mostly due to the small-scale civil war in Turkey. And I think this wave is also important. I think in the literature we will be also referring to this exodus, if it's the correct word to say. So after the Gezi protests, now there is a massive wave of migration from Turkey, but the categorizing these migrants is really difficult because people from different walks of life are leaving Turkey now, and our recent research with Erdi focused on this phenomenon. So can we call it an exodus? Who are moving with what motivations? And we find really interesting results. Some were predictable, but some are also really interesting. And we told to each other, oh, we weren't expecting this. So I would like to share these interesting remarks with you today. So just to give you an idea, for example, from Gezi protests until 2018, asylum applications from Turkey to Europe were like a few thousands. But after the coup attempt, it just reached to 10,000, even within a couple of months after the coup attempt. And for example, just in 2018, there were 10,000 asylum applications to Germany only. Since the coup attempt, around 20,000 asylum applications were made to Greece, and in 2020 even, despite the lockdown and COVID, there are still around 15,000 asylum applications to different European countries from Turkey. So these numbers are significant. Of course, they are not comparable to the mass migration from Syria and other countries which are in constant conflict, but it still made Turkey the third country after Syria and Iraq, an asylum seeker sending country to Europe and beyond. So these numbers are important. So when we talk about the migration flows after the Gezi protests, we can talk about the migration of secular individuals from Turkey. Many scholars refer to that. Just these are people who made a lifestyle decision. They did not want to live under the AKP rule in Turkey, so they left via different routes. This could be work visas, student visas, or the Ankara Agreement, for example, which was available in the UK for a long time. So we can also categorize them as white collar, so people who had a really good education in Turkey, they just, start applying for jobs abroad and they go to different countries all around the world. Most people came to Europe, the UK, Germany, and the USA by finding jobs only, so via using work permits routes. And of course, after the coup attempt, we have a category of the Gülenists. The Gülen movement was already a transnational movement, so there were a lot of Gülenists living outside Turkey anyways, and they had missions in different countries, etc. But we see a massive exodus of Gülenists after the coup attempt because they were blamed or they were responsible for the coup attempt in Turkey. We see a continuous migration of Kurds as well, especially after the collapse of the peace process, which actually gave many people hopes about a potential peace. Perhaps not a full settlement, but at least people were hoping that the political violence will cease to exist, but it did not happen. And in 2015 and 16, it reached a maximum level of escalation again. So this drove many people away. Also, people like Kurds who joined protest movements in Turkey or who joined the legal political parties were also stigmatized and criminalized in the long run, and they also fled the country. And finally, there is a category of academics, so academics from all over Turkey who signed the Academics for Peace petition, basically making a call to the Turkish government to stop violence in the Kurdish majority regions in Turkey and to resume the peace process. And it was criminalized by the ruling elite, and then people lost their jobs and they had to flee temporarily or permanently from Turkey. So these are different categories, but of course they overlap. So people who are seculars can also be academics, and Kurds also can be Gülenists, so these can overlap. Just a second. Sorry for that. So when we talk about the different routes, we can talk about asylum. So people crossed borders somehow and applied for asylum. They used the work visa, student visas, or they used the Ankara agreement rule, so they found business in the UK and came through this way. And also some people used the golden visa method, which means, sorry, I apologize again. So they bought property in countries like Portugal and Malta, and they were given permanent residencies there. So some people, we interviewed a lot of people and asked about their motivations and the ways they left the country. So some said they left permanently. Some considered themselves in exile and they were waiting for the right moment to return. And some were in kind of a circular migration where they seek opportunities for permanent residencies. But they lived in Turkey still, but they had a ticket. So if something goes wrong, they could immediately leave the country. So that's why they made agreements, that they opened business abroad just to make sure that if something goes bad, they can leave the country. So when we look at the motivations of people who left, we found that the first reason was, of course, human security, especially for the Gülenists and Kurds. They didn't feel like they had a fair system in Turkey where the trials will, continue fairly, and they were they had concerns about torture in prison, etc. So they wanted to leave as soon as possible. Some people left because of their family. They wanted a better future for their children. So even though there was no immediate threat, they just wanted to leave. Some left for economic reasons. Others left for a better education, so better opportunities in the future. And some just mentioned that they didn't have rights in Turkey, especially women and the LGBTI community members mentioned these as main motivations. So the routes that the newcomers use are really interesting. When we look at the white colors, for example, it was just simple job applications. And because they were voluntary movements, they actually made cost-benefit analysis. So which country offers the best job market, which city offers the best, cafes and the views and the nightlife. And they also, they could look at different neighborhoods, even they chose where to live before they even moved here. Especially the ones, for example, who came with the Ankara agreement, they really made a lifestyle choice. But for the Gülenists and Kurds, that was not the case. Most of the time, the migration was involuntary. For example, when somebody heard that there's a trial against them, they were accused of terrorist propaganda, so they had to leave the country immediately. Or the Gülenists, as soon as the coup attempt happened, they had to leave. So involuntary decisions meant that there were no calculations most of the time, so they used whatever route was possible to them. So the Gülenists, for example, we know from newspaper headlines, they usually, mention how lives are lost in the Evros River or how perilous these journeys are. But we know that the elite members of the movement have already left the country, most of them, not all of them, but have left the country before the coup attempt even happened. And they already had visas for the US or for Europe, so they went as tourists and they applied for asylum if they thought that they might not go back to Turkey Turkey at some point, so they came as tourists first. And there are some others, for example, who chose a different route, and they went to visa-free countries for Turkey, especially in the Balkans, such as North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo. And in Macedonia, for example, they found a business, and you just need around €1,000 or so to find a business to obtain permanent residency. And then they applied for a tourist visa for European countries, mostly Germany, because 50% of the newcomers actually chose Germany as a destination. And then they applied for a tourist visa for Germany. They crossed the border, and when they arrived to Germany, they applied for asylum. Also, they chose visa-free countries in Africa and Asia. South Africa was one of them, for example. When I was working at Stellenbosch University in 2016, I have met many newcomers who just told me, who didn't tell me that they belonged to the Gülen movement, etc., but they were just a middle-aged man coming to South Africa to learn English, and they could get visiting visas like that, which can be extended for education purposes. So this was one of the observations I had. Kurdish students, we interviewed used different methods. Mostly they used fake passports, and they chose ways towards Portugal and Malta. They used different types of passports, and then when they reached their destination country, they applied for asylum. But there are also others who had pending trials, especially about the Roboski protests, etc. Some of them used Ankara agreement, for example. So not all the Kurds actually used the asylum method. So if they can obtain work visas, they go for that route. So these are like different profiles, and they use different ways to come here. And now in European countries, they formed a new wave of the diaspora. And most of the scholars who focus on diaspora communities, we usually look at how they are formed and how they are politically active, etc. But the relationship between the new waves and the previous waves are not really studied. So we don't know now what the impact of the new wave will be on the existing diaspora communities and their activism. Looking at the profile and depending on our fieldwork, we actually found out that not many people desire to be politically active when they arrive to their destination country. Some are coming here just to be forgotten. Some are coming here just to be more active about their issues or cause in Turkey. And some just do not want to engage with Turkish communities at all. They come for a better life, and they want to, integrate into the society they live without having relationships with the Turkish community. But if you look at the relationships between the old and new groups, we see some tensions occurring, especially the way that the newcomers look at the previous diaspora is really interesting. The previous diaspora members that we have interviewed, for example, said that the newcomers come and they try to find new organizations, democratic alliances, without actually checking what's already there since the 80s, and they feel like they are not taken seriously, and they are really fragmented. So the newcomers do not want to associate with previous leftist or Kurdish organizations. They just keep finding their own. So there is an inflation of politically active diaspora communities, which actually have little leverage on political processes. Moreover, we find that many people do not want to be associated with the Gülen movement at all, and they do not want to build alliances in the diaspora either. Our interviewees, for example, mentioned that if you're going to write academic articles or books with Erdi, for example, some just tell us, if you are interviewing Gülenists as well, we don't want to be involved in your research. There's this kind of a polarization also in the diaspora. Some of our interviewees mentioned that in the Heims, for example, in refugee camps, when Gülenists and Kurds meet at the individual level, there can be some alliance. But what we found was that most of the leftist groups and the dissident groups actually have negative feelings towards the Gülen movement, not just because of the coup attempt, but because of what has happened in the past. So people know that the authoritarian regime in Turkey was not built in one day, so they also accused the Gülen movement for their cooperation with the AKP for many, many years. And especially the Gülen movement was really hostile towards Kurdish activism. So this scarred the Kurdish political memory, and these things are remembered. So the newcomers do not automatically build alliances and show solidarity against each other. Some newcomers receive solidarity from previous diaspora organizations, but as long as they can stand on their feet, they try to form new ones, and that's what we found so far. But our research is going on. The last issue is just the prospects for return. So we find that many people actually came with the idea to return, but if they have children and if they start building lives abroad, they do not want to plan a return in the short run now. Plus, many people did not sound hopeful about an imminent political change in Turkey. Actually, people, think that it will get worse before it gets better. So they try to find a way to live and make their lives, meaningful in the host countries. And I can elaborate more if there are any questions from the audience. But so far, return is not on the agenda, but people just want the right to return. So they want the trials to be over against them. They want the freedom to return, but that doesn't mean that they will go back as soon as they are free to go. So I'll stop here, and thank you so much for listening to me with this voice. Sorry, I apologize again for my coughing. Thank you.
I wish you a quick recovery, Bahar, and thank you so much for summarizing all of these new findings and some parts of our joint research. And I think your experience is quite important for us. But you write an article and edit a book about conducting research on Kurds. But as far as I can understand, within this new migrants, new wave, I think it is time for us to think about that, to write something regarding methodology and conducting research regarding the Turkey's new diasporas. Because I know from that research, particularly quote unquote famous people or active in social media, they see themselves very famous, very decent, very important, and being an indicator for Turkish politics. And they said that no, if there is a Gülenis, if there is a Kurd, if there is a liberal, or if there is a leftist, I won't be the same. I won't be this part of same chapter, same book, same project. So this is something they try to make themselves priceless, unique, alone, and important, and not involving any issues. I think this is another political and psychological problem of this issue. But I have lots of questions regarding the conflicts, possible collaborations, and hidden and open conflicts and hidden and open collaborations between the newcomers and the old diasporas during the Q&A session. But again, I would like to turn to Nate, because from Nate's report, actually, we've been talking a lot about Turkey's extraterritorial authoritarianism, extraterritorial authoritarian outreach, but with your reports, we found how Turkey is important in this issue. Important is quote unquote, or active, I would say. And what is the position of Turkey comparing to other illiberal, repressive countries that have been they are eligible to reach the outside of their borders? So, that would be great if you can hear your previous and current findings regarding Turkey's extraterritorial authoritarianism. Nate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Erdi, and thank you, ELIAMEP, for inviting me. And it's always an honor to be able to speak alongside Turkish experts on this subject. And I'll be clear, I'm not an expert on the Turkish diaspora, so my focus is really on authoritarianism, on the behavior of the Turkish state abroad. I'm going to try some different ideas here than some others that I've explored previously, I think, in other conversations that I've had with you all, both in public and in private. And it's to try to widen this a little bit to this question of transnational authoritarianism and not solely transnational repression per se. So what do I mean by that? I would like to try to define transnational authoritarianism as the sum of all the forms through which a state is trying to impose authoritarian controls across borders on both nationals and non-nationals alike. So the state is trying to impose domestic conditions of non-accountability, non-transparency on nationals and non-nationals abroad, ultimately with the goal of supporting the continuity of a certain model of governance at home, a certain authoritarian model. Now, within this bigger scheme, and in keeping with modern definitions and discussions of authoritarianism, I would sketch out 3 pillars of state activity that I'll try to describe in the Turkish case. So these are mobilization of constituencies abroad on behalf of authoritarian practices. So this includes voter mobilization, but also other forms of mobilization, cultural and social mobilization, influencing and lobbying, including through covert or gray zone means, but sometimes through overt, legal means of politicians, non-state actors, and also collaboration with other authoritarian actors abroad. I'm going to speak less about that pillar, but I want to make sure to be clear that I include it. And then the third, which is the one that we've worked on the most already, is repression of nationals abroad in order to silence them using coercion. So this is what we've called transnational repression, what has been broadly discussed. So let me speak about these in the Turkish case, then try to say a few things with diaspora. And again, apologies, I'm trying to work through this as I think, because I'm trying to find a more apt model for all the complexities that are always raised whenever we drill into cases. So prior to 2016, I would argue that the Turkish state was infrequently engaged in transnational repression, but was engaged in transnational mobilization on behalf of an authoritarian model. Particularly in the 2010s, mirroring, starting in the early 2010s or late 2007, 2008 period, mirroring the developments inside of Turkey, the state increasingly focused energies on mobilizing diaspora members towards a more centralized, authoritarian, statist system that especially is built around President Erdogan. And I don't think we can, I'm often accused, or I have been accused, of Erdogan ad absurdum, reducing things, reductio ad Erdoganum. But I don't think we can ignore the causal role of Erdogan's own drive to try to change the state, to try to make the state identical with himself, and to try to place himself at the center of all aspects of it. As this went on, you have these very dynamic forms of mobilization that include positive forms of mobilization of elevating Erdogan's status or of voting for the AKP and kind of engaging in this positive construction, but also include excluding or marginalizing other actors abroad, sometimes even through conflict or violence. The second factor, so the other causal factor, which is related to this causal factor, is the collapse of the Gülen-AKP alliance in 2013, I would argue. I think that, as has been so well discussed by others on this panel in their work, the Gülen movement as a diaspora by design, as a inherently transnational movement, and one that was very closely tied to the state, had been taken for granted or acted as an arm of the state. And with that arm removed, post-2013, the AKP and Erdogan became very aware of their vulnerability in international circles, and concentrated both on securing that part of the diaspora, controlling that part of the diaspora, the movement itself, but also securing the diaspora more broadly without that support. And so there's a shift in the Turkish state's influencing and lobbying campaigns and mobilization that is in part responding to the vulnerability that they feel without the Gülen movement as their arm. Now that brings me then to repression, per se. I agree with what Professor Kaya said. There has been efforts for decades to control the diaspora. I mean, I think this is quite evident throughout the 80s as there's these very politicized, polarized conflicts within the diaspora. There are efforts to control it, but I think that in what I've seen, this seldom escalated to truly state-organized direct repression in the way we're seeing now in certain elements. And there's two I want to highlight. One is in the report, the other is not. So the one that's not, and which I am trying to think about more and more, in part because of conversations we have had, Erdi and Bahar, is extraterritorial enforcement of domestic norms, especially around speech. So as we all know, as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, Turkey has very stringent, but also quite arbitrary regulations and rules governing speech within Turkey. You know, notorious for people being investigated, prosecuted, imprisoned for tweets, journalism, all sorts of speech activities that should be protected. It seems that we are seeing now increasingly individuals in the diaspora who engage in speech abroad, who then return to Turkey for a professional or a personal reason or any reason, being prosecuted for that speech that they engaged in abroad under Turkey's domestic norms. Now, this isn't what we called transnational repression in our report. It's not what I think most of the scholars of transnational repression talk about, because it takes place within Turkey, but it is essentially applying still a domestic norm on an extraterritorial action. It's trying to regulate that extraterritorial action. So I think this trend in that direction, which we could see in prominent cases like Tuna Altanel recently. There's quite a number of other less prominent ones of people who've returned to Turkey and been prosecuted for social media posts or detained. This is, I think, an expansion of the state's remit and definitely an extension of how the state sees its ability, sees its role in terms of enforcing those norms on people who live abroad and act abroad. And then the second part, this brings me to, transnational repression proper, I guess what we would call, and what we discuss most in the report, which in the Turkish case really escalated after the coup attempt in 2016. So this is acting outside of the state's borders against the state's nationals to coerce them with the aim of silencing them. I won't go into a lot of elaborate detail about how this works or what it is, but essentially, since July 2016, there has been this very expansive global campaign, particularly of renditions. It has involved bringing back well over 100 people around the world to Turkey in illegal operations. This is from some 18 countries, perhaps more. This is definitely the most wide-ranging, most comprehensive campaign of renditions that's taking place in the world at this time. It's still going on. It's happening literally in the last few weeks. I can name cases. And it is remarkable, it is notable, it is unusual, right? And when I say it's the most wide-ranging campaign, I'm including examination of Chinese operations, including examination of Russian and Rwandan and Iranian. This is a very big, important development in how Turkey is engaged abroad. Some things we could talk, I think, about what's important about it. As we move forward, I think some of the things that I've remarked on before that I think are worth thinking about in the context of the state's relationship to its diaspora and to its nationals abroad include what does it mean to have a campaign that is overtly illegal? This is something that the UN has written multiple letters now to the Turkish state about, speaking about the ways in which the tactics violate international law. Something that where there really isn't even a pretense on the part of the Turkish state that these operations take place within a legal framework. They're normally declared as intelligence operations abroad. And tied in with that then as well, the propaganda component of how this is broadcast and what the message is both for people within Turkey and people without Turkey about the Turkish state and about the powers that be. The other part, which I perhaps haven't talked about as much before, but I do want to emphasize, is what it means as this becomes an institutional practice. So there's other institutions that Professor Kaya, for instance, raised that have developed, as we see, there's this evolution in the Turkish state's institutional design and institutions that are formulated for this. Now, there are institutions that are engaged in this practice, and there is behind this a whole set of norms that are developing within the Turkish state. These operations, which now again, this involves over 100 people, this involves operating in every continent in the world. This involves the MFA, this involves the MIT, the intelligence agency. This most likely involves the Ministry of Interior in its collaboration as the law enforcement organ of the state. And so in that sense, you have participation of very important institutions in a formal sense in this campaign, and that means that you are developing a set of practices that right now is definitely applied primarily, almost exclusively, though not exclusively, to Glenis, but which, as it becomes normalized and instituted into the state, I think has important repercussions across and maybe extended to others. Now, let me just conclude by saying some of the things about what this may mean or could mean for the diaspora, very hypothetical. To me, this seems that the institutionalization of these practices over time, so the mobilization aspect, the extraterritorial policing of speech, the campaign of renditions, these essentially drive towards further mistrust of the state within the diaspora among different factions, alienation from state representatives, a sense that the state is not a neutral arbiter or is not a neutral actor in its relationship to citizens or diaspora members abroad. And unfortunately, I do think that drives, and it was important for me to hear Professor Kaya saying the similar things from his perspective, that this drives towards polarization and conflict. This drives towards the kinds of features within the diaspora that definitely dominate politics inside of Turkey right now, have been present in the diaspora for decades, but it exacerbates those conflicts. It makes everyone in the diaspora who participates in public life kind of a partisan, whether they want to be or not, because you're forced to choose sides. And then second, and sort of a subnote, though, Erdi, I think you've worked on this more than I, though, but it's always a very important topic and something, if people want to discuss, maybe we do, is the Gulen movement abroad and what it means for these many thousands of people, or tens of thousands, however we define it, of people who become a diaspora by default now, who have no future in Turkey as a place, and who are this other social group who live permanently abroad, sometimes in comfortable positions, depending on their status and education and capacities, and sometimes in very uncomfortable positions, sometimes in very marginal and liminal positions, depending on who they are. And that, I think, over time may become not a huge part of the diaspora, because the diaspora is so large, but an important part of the diaspora to think about, as these people have no future within Turkey itself, which is different from other members of the diaspora who have mostly some future in which they could be in Turkey if they chose to be. And I'll conclude on that. I mean, I think that this government, has a very arduous task of rebuilding trust with the diaspora. I think any future Turkish government that isn't this government has the same task. How do you rebuild trust in a diaspora that has been so deeply divided and fractured? And I think that addressing these practices of overt authoritarianism will be one of those tasks for a government that wants to try to move beyond this and try to restore trust in the diaspora if there's an opportunity for that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nate, for this very rich and, very, very interesting findings. Actually, officially, we have only 8 minutes. But after we talk that much about authoritarianism, I would like to use my authority as the moderator and the member of ELIAMEP Turkey program and extend more 15-20 minutes for Q&A, because you talk lots of important issues, but we need to unpack them and scrutinize a lot. Could you please correct me, but I think I summarize your presentations into 4 main points. The first thing is that when Professor Kaya's presentation, indeed there is a continuity within the Turkish state heritage regarding controlling, using, instrumentalizing diasporas, but at the same time within the AKP, or with the starting of the AKP's second or third term, it's hard to divide, but there is also big captures and transformations for the Turkey's diaspora management. Secondly, from Bahar's point, and this new Turkey's new diasporas, both from the home state perspective and also into the host state perspective, and also from the diaspora's point of view, it is impossible to define it with only as only one single layer. There are horizontal and vertical different layers. They've been crossing some crossroads each other. So it makes this issue even much more complicated, even much more dynamic at the same time. The third thing is that even though it seems that the conflict between Gülen movement and AKP or Turkey state is over inside Turkey, there is a conflict outside of Turkey, and without understanding what Gülen movement is, who are the members of these movements, and what was their issue with state, with Justice and Development Party, with politics and with society, it is impossible to understand not only Turkey's transformation, but also today's and the future's diasporas of Turkey. I'm instantly using the diasporas because it seems that Turkey has many different diasporas right now. The last thing is that, there has been an institutionalization of the transnational repression and diaspora control, and this means that even if one day, likewise every human, everything, we will see the end of the Justice and Development Party, but the institutional practices, institutional norms, and the heritages maybe will push and continue that kind of repressions or controlling to the diasporas. These are the 4 points that I can summarize from your points. And now, to my questions and your remarks. I mean, if you don't mind, I would like to go first with Professor Kaya, because I think one issue is quite important. You mentioned that one of your new studies also indicate that there has been a global rivalry competition among different Muslim actors and host countries. Christian majority countries, states are also the part of this Islamic competition, and diasporas is one of the key players. In one of my articles, I think I cited you, and I said that instrumentalization of Islam to diaspora control. Do you think Turkey has a chance within this game with Diyanet, TİKA, or other institutions? Because what we know that Turkish understanding of Islam is very different compared to the Moroccan, Tunisian, Iranian, Saudi understanding of Islam, or that newly emerging French type of Islam at the same time. But you also underline that current, for example, Diyanet's role is to promote to AKP's Islam. What is Turkey's Islam? What is AKP's Islam? And how you positionize the role of religion with all of these diaspora competition and the rivalry with the other actors?
Erdi, thank you very much. Just very briefly, I want to make 2 points. The first point is that, as Nath and Bahar also put it very well, I argue that there is continuity of ways in which the Turkish state has organized its diaspora politics, since the early 1990s, since Özal came to power in late 1980s and also in 1990s. The state has always been very, strong in trying to shape the Turkish diaspora. First, let's say the earlier regime, Kemalist regime, was very much engaged in organizing the Turkish diaspora along with some ethnocultural and political, parameters. The main rationale was to make sure that the Kurdish member of the diaspora would not be really rebellious in diaspora. I remember very well from my own field research back in the 1990s and 2000s. I remember several members of the Turkish military, retired or active members of the Turkish army, paid a lot of visits to different European capitals in order to mobilize the members of the Turkish diaspora along with this militarist legacy, right? Islam was not really that important in those days, or any other instrument. But nationalism was the decisive element of the Turkish diaspora politics in those days. Nowadays, we see that this is continuing. It is still very active in organizing the Turkish diaspora, not along nationalist lines, Sunni lines. So, in that sense, there is a continuation of the Turkish state in organizing Turkish diaspora, but the tools that the Turkish state is using has differed. It has become more Islamist, not really that nationalist. And the second point that I want to make in response to your question is that previously, when we, of course, if we talk about the diaspora politics of the sending states, let's say, has also something to do with the integration and migration policies of the receiving states. It's a dialectical process. So if we are, let's say, critical at this moment of the ways in which the Turkish state actors try to organize the Turkish diaspora, it also means that we need to be critical of the ways in which the receiving states have so far framed the members of the, let's say, Turkish diaspora. So I see this as a two-way traffic. And here what I'm trying to say is that previously the receiving states, Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, in my own case, because I have been concentrating on these four countries, there has always been something fundamentally wrong with the ways in which these states have tried to accommodate Turkish origin or migrant origin people in their own countries. They specifically saw these people simply as Muslims, right? And they asked the sending states to control this religious space by asking for imams or muezzins or religious personnel hosted from, let's say, Turkey, from Morocco, etc., etc. And this has created a space in which the sending states have been always very active in, organizing these diaspora communities along with religious lines. But this was not sustainable. And over the last 10 years, at least, the receiving states have changed their tactic, their strategy, and they started to become more active in the organization of this religious space by trying to raise their own imams or create their own national Islams, right? And now this transnational space has created different competing forms of Islam. And I think Turkey is also very strong, but competing with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the Iranians, as well as with the other, migrant sending countries. And I think Turkish state at the moment is using this strategy, which was actually earlier. It is, of course, interesting and paradoxical. It's using the strategy which was earlier designed by the Gülenists. So this kind of thing is really interesting for me, because I argue that the Turkish state is still using those institutions designed by the Gülenist circles earlier, but the Turkish state does not have the capacity and intellectual power to fill in this vacuum, which is there because of the solution of the alliance between the AKP and the Gülenist circles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaya. I mean, your answers remind me to 1980s. The first thing is that the main ideology was Turkish Islamic synthesis right after 1980s. But right now, it seems that according to your remark, we are moving an Islamic Turkic synthesis. Priority is Islam, secondary is nationalism. And for the importance of the Gülenist ideas regarding instrumentalization of Islam, it again reminds me in 1980s. There was a motto calling that their ideas are in power, but they are in prison for nationalists. But now maybe we can call that they are in exile or in jail, but their ideas, their tools still in power. So this is something very important to understand Turkey. Thank you so much. Bahar, I mean, I have one question, but this question has many different layers actually. I mean, what about the second and the third generation? Because what we know that currently the Turkish diasporas that have been starting in 1960s has been in the moving to the third generation, and it has been more than 5 years for Gülenists, for academics, for members of Academics for Peace, or the others within the exile or in diaspora for more than 5 years, and they are also kids are also in diaspora. What is their crossroads? What is their relations? Because what we know that their parents are not in a good mood. Their parents are not in a collaboration. But what about the second generation? Because these conflicts, yes, from your marvelous PhD to your book, you mentioned about the importation of domestic conflicts. What about the inheriting of the domestic conflicts with the generations inside the diaspora, and whether it it will be a security issue for European or Western countries or not? What is your predictions about this issue?
Thank you so much, Adi, for the question. So when I wrote my PhD, it was between 2008 and 2012. So the YTB was not even that visible in the diaspora, you know, and it was mostly the umbrella diaspora organizations who were occupying the transnational space. And now this is not the case. For example, now it's the AKP's own diaspora organizations which are running the field. But during my time, it was different. When I interviewed young people at the time, second or third generation, um, my impression was that they were highly affected by the political views of their parents, and the fragmentations were also inherited. But for example, in the Kurdish case, I found that, for example, I interviewed a father who was tortured in Turkish prisons, you know, captured when he was active in the Kurdish movement, and he had even like, you know, permanent injuries because of that. And he was very hopeful about the peace process, and he wanted to return to Turkey one day, visit his hometown, and maybe, you know, serve in different committees, etc. But his son, for example, was full of hatred against Turkey, and he couldn't forgive the state which, you know, injured his father that way. So I found sometimes the second generation was actually less compromised, less open to compromise in terms of the peace process, etc. I think I will find a similar trend with the newcomers, but I didn't have the chance to do fieldwork with the second generation who came with their parents, or the 1.5 generation right now. So I haven't been in the field. I haven't done a survey, so I don't know how their relations are shaping up. But from my previous experience, I remember when I was interviewing a member of the Grey Wolves in Berlin, this young guy who was a university student at that time told me every time he meets Kurds in Berlin, and when he knows that they came after the 80s, he said, I always ask myself what they have done to damage the Turkish state. So they are here because they must be guilty of something. So for him, asylum seeker meant terrorists or traitor. So in this case now, I see like similar stigmatization has been done against the Gulen movement members, and also, but this doesn't mean that the Gulen community perceives, for example, the Kurdish activists this way or the leftists this way, etc. So there's so much polarization that's coming from Turkey, and I think it will also be revealed on the second generation. Just think about this, for example, my interviewees from the Kurdish community, they were saying that, you know, my mom never allowed me to speak Kurdish in front of the Turkish community because something bad might happen. So I you know, hid my Kurdish identity for a while, etc. So I think the similar things are now happening to the Gulen movement members, etc. Or even the, you know, academics for peace members that we have interviewed. Some of them said they do not want to engage with the Turkish community for potential stigmatization for their children in schools, etc. Because the newcomers believe that, especially in countries like France and Germany, the majority of Turkish migrants supports the current regime, so they don't want to reveal their identities immediately. And I think the children are also told to hide their identity, at least like the ideological background of their parents, for the similar reason. Because the new wave, although there are white colors, as we talked about, the new wave is mostly dissidents. Although they don't agree with each other and they are fragmented, it's still they are dissidents to the current regime, and I think these tensions are still harboring among the second generation as well. But I think a systematic research is needed for that, and it has been such a short time. I think in diaspora studies, 5 years is a very short time to understand this kind of dynamics, but I'm sure they are simmering at the moment.
Sorry. I mean, thank you so much for this marvelous answer. I mean, it seems that we will talk about new Turkeys, new diasporas for a long time of period. I mean, as you clearly enlightened us, the 5 years is not enough. This is just a cocoon position of all of these diaspora movements in that stage. Nate, actually, I asked that question to you previously, but I would like to one time to put it in in the record. I would like to ask the same question again to you, because there particularly non-Turkish academics has been scrutinizing the issue of the new Turkey's new diasporas and extraterritorial repression, they underline that we, as the Turkish scholars, have been exaggerating the activities of Turkey comparing the other country cases. You are a part of a team and comparing very different country cases. And are we really exaggerating Turkey's activities, or what? I mean, is it impossible to categorize the victimizations? It is impossible to categorize that kind of brutal activities. But at the same time, I think you can, as a policymaker, as a researcher, you can give us a idea where is the Turkey's position among a big ball.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very complex question on at least two dimensions. So on the first dimension, which is simply like the scale of activity, and I guess in some sense its level of violence, which I think is always important to understand, the Turkish one is very much at an extreme. When I speak about more than 100 people brought back to Turkey, these are people who were brought back through extralegal operations. I mean, these are frequently people taken off the streets, held incommunicado in detention. We don't know what happened to them for a month or a week while they were held incommunicado before they were transferred to the Turkish state. There's lots of allegations of abuse and torture. This is a very extreme thing if we think about kind of the height of the global war on terror, the US global war on terror. That involved bringing back several hundred people, right, in a very intense period, about one or 2 years primarily, when the height of that took place, 2002 to 2004. But you know, the Turkish campaign is at a very high scale of violence, of intensity, of global spread. It involves going to many different countries on many different continents. Now, I think the more accurate but also complex question is about this other dimension of whom is targeted. And we did try to examine this in our report, and I mean, I won't say it, you know, disguise it. Vast majority of this is targeted at Gülenes. This is a kidnapping campaign directed at Gülenes, with the exception of, I think, 2 individuals who we've identified who are not, one of whom was alleged to be a DHKPC activist. The other's alleged to be, he was a BDP member. Those are the only people we found who were rendered in this period of time who are clearly not Gülenes. And the rest quite clearly were. So in that sense, is it separate, right, from the rest of the diaspora? I think we've discussed this before. That's a question. What does this mean? You know, do other people have to fear this? My argument is that, one, I think there's an institutionalization that takes place and a normalization of practices, and that's why it's important to keep in mind. So it's not that, you know, again, we're in a very short period of time. This is in 5 years. If this continues, and it is continuing, right? This is a campaign that's ongoing right now. If this continues for 5 more years, who will be the enemy of the state in 5 years? Especially with the Turkish tradition of rotating enemies of the state and new ones being presented or emerging over time. Who will be the enemy in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, and how will these tactics be applied to them, I think is worth asking. So that would be my main response to that. I mean, the second part of it is that it also shows and embodies a way of thinking for the state, a way that the state sees its citizens or sees those abroad. And yes, we're talking about a specific group that is blamed and accused of a very specific crime in some cases, although I will point out the people who are being brought back, as far as we can tell, based on what we've seen about the specific cases, these are not people who are accused of a specific activity related to July 15th, right? To the extent that we know about what these people are accused of or what they have done or where they were, these are people who are accused of being FETÖ. And that's enough. They are not accused of some specific activity that led them to, the coup attempt itself, or that was involved in the coup attempt itself, or some other criminal activity. In a proper sense. And so I think in that sense, you have this way of seeing like a state, that the state sees these people abroad, that again can be widened to other groups and may well be widened to other groups over time. So I don't think it's, look, you see op-eds, You see, I know Enes Kanter had an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday. There's always going to be an element of kind of a presentation for certain audiences that will frustrate any expert or any Turkish citizen to say this is too simplified, or this doesn't account for things that the Gulen movement was responsible for when they were in alliance, or doesn't account for what they did in 2016. Yet, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is, globally speaking, a very serious campaign, very important for understanding how the Turkish state sees itself and how it will evolve, especially if we reach a point in time in which there is a new government through elections, and that new government has to reckon with this whole period, right? And any government that comes in will have to reckon with a very long period of AKP rule that includes a wide variety of, frankly, crimes, some of which are like this, some of which involve corruption, some of which involve the war within the state, within Turkey, and this will be among them, and it will be something they'll have to reckon with from a human rights perspective and transitional justice perspective, but also from the perspective of how do we change these practices so that they don't, so that this isn't just what the state does, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nate. I mean, whenever one will told me that you're exaggerating the Turkish case, I will give your answer as an answer, my own, with quoting you. Any concluding remarks from any of you? Bahar, please.
Thank you so much, Erdi. I will just say two things as my general observations about what's going on now. The first one is that, now a mafia boss is abroad. He fled Turkey because of some dispute with some members of the ruling elite, and now he's making videos, and he is acting as a dissident abroad. So it shows me two things, like the enemies of the state, as Nate referred to, is changing. It's always a concept that's in transformation in Turkey. So today's allies are tomorrow's enemies, and it keeps changing. What stays stable for now is the one-man rule, and then the party or the president became the state, and we always, when we refer to the state, we actually mean those people. So there's this constant transformation, actually, and we don't know who is going to be the next enemy, and whether there will be alliances between the previous enemies, etc. So this is what makes Turkish politics interesting for me. The second one is that you see in the media now, national media but also internationally, that people talk about whether Turkey is trying to kill this man, the mafia boss who fled Turkey. So for me, this is interesting because people are not discussing anymore whether Turkey is capable of doing these things, or whether Turkey, as a prestigious, respectful state, would actually commit acts like this. People already now accepted that it does things like this, and this is, for me, really interesting. So I think 20 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about these extraterritorial illegal operations, and Nate also mentioned this a lot. Maybe they happened, but it wasn't in the news. But we normalize these now, and I find it alarming, but at the same time, as a political scientist, it triggers my interest about concepts like, sovereignty, repression, and the limits to these things. But these are my observations. So I don't think that the mafia guy is that important, but it just unpacks a lot of different issues related to Turkish politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bahar. Professor Kaya, please.
Thank you very much, Erdi. We are talking about transnational phenomena. And if we are talking about a transnational phenomena, that means that the actors involved in this phenomena are several, not only the sending state, but also the receiving state, but also the receiving society, but also the international organizations, etc., etc. So, as I try to explain in my contribution, I try to underline that the Turkish diaspora politics has become lately very much religious-based. So the lesson to draw from this case, I argue, is we need to try to move the lens, or we need to try to change our lenses rather than trying to put everything into this religious box while explaining the root causes of social, economic, whatever phenomena. I think the receiving states, first of all, need to change their perception of the migrant origin people, meaning that instead of framing these people as simply Muslims, they need to hold on to civic identification, meaning that, first of all, most of these people are supposed to be their equal citizens who deserve to be treated as equal as the other native members of the society. This is number one thing. Another thing that needs to be underlined is that the sending states, in this case, the Turkish state, is using this religious discourse to a great extent simply because there is this Islamophobic climate. So, in order for us to see the Turkish state playing less with the religious tool, we need to make sure that Islamophobia will be combated. So I think the more Islamophobic the European society at large becomes, the more sending states will try to hold on to this Islamist discourse, because Islamophobia paradoxically plays into their hands. Islamophobia paradoxically feeds into their religious Islamist discourse. So this is my final statement. Thank you.
I think this is very important issue, because whenever we talk with my counterpartners, with colleagues from abroad, when they talk about the overdose instrumentalization of Islam by the Turkey's current leader, I'm always giving an example. Erdogan has a very significant presence in the streets of Europe due to the Europe's lack of integration policies or the current discourses. So they are feeding each other very badly. So I think that's a marvelous point that you underlined. Nate, your last words?
Only very briefly to forward on what Professor Kaya and you just said, which is the way in which these transnational repression campaigns, which are in our study as well, the global study we did in February, we see as predominantly, the majority of victims are Muslims, in fact, which speaks to the precarity of Muslims who are moving across borders. The response to this campaign of transnational repression, whether it is Turkish or other, must involve acknowledging the ways in which the host societies have kept people on the margins, or in which host states, especially migration and law enforcement policies, create openings in which authoritarian states can act. And that is, that's not just kind of a talking point to say that we all have to look within ourselves. I mean, it's just true. It's true about how this operates, that there has to be, in order to be more resilient against attempts to exploit democratic systems in order to target people, you have to find ways to build trust and to separate the identity of those people from their essentially their religious identity primarily, although there's other ways, of course, in which people are being classed. But to separate that and allow them to have the relationship of a rights-holding individual, principally towards the state, and to see them as that, instead of as a member of a suspect religious community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, mate. I mean, even though it seems that we only aim to talk about Turkey and Turkey's diasporas, but we talk a broader issue, because the illiberalization of the world has been continuing, even though one can claim that with the election of Biden it's over. No, it's not over. I mean, the Trumpism or in Europe, or like far right, it's still alive. And Erdogan is one of the key and very experienced players of this global illiberalization, global authoritarian populism, and these leaders mostly instrumentalizing religion, nationalism. But when we turn back to Turkey, before our event, I read a news. One of the pro-AKP survey companies, in its first time in its history, found that if there will be an election, presidential election tomorrow, Erdogan most likely will lose his chair. And this is the first time one pro-AKP survey company announced that to Cumhuriyet, which is not pro-AKP newspaper. So maybe that kind of issues, Turkey's shrinking economy, conflict between different power groups, seems that we would be at the very beginning of an end of an Erdogan period. But from your presentations, your remarks, what I can understand that we will at the very beginning of the new Turkey's new diaspora processes, and maybe Erdogan will leave his chair tomorrow or the other day, but we will talk about the Turkey's different kind of earthquakes and its reflections to the diaspora in the future. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you so much for your time and effort. And I really hope to see you in a normal conferences with the normal communication periods. Thank you so much again.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
You.
Bye-bye.